Welcome to another episode of Indiana Politics. I'm Deb Chubb, and we are just delighted today to be with Karen Francisco, who is the editor of the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette Editorial Page. And we are going to talk about the 2021 legislative session. So here, Karen is well informed and manages the editorial page, and so has lots of references to other great writers among the people in Fort Wayne and herself to talk about these issues. So today I really want to talk about, 1005, the education bill, and I want to talk about the permitless carry bill that's traveling through that will allow anybody to have a gun, no questions asked. And I want to talk about the wetlands bill. So let's start with the education bill. Tell us what is you could start with like the worst. What is the worst thing in House Bill 1005 for public schools?
Well, there's a lot. That bill has a lot of moving parts to it. And it is the one that really seems to have caught the attention of public education advocates this year, just because it is so sweeping. It's a big expansion of the Choice Scholarship Program, which is Indiana's voucher program that has been in effect since 2011. And since that was first adopted, that voucher program has it has grown with lots of it generally, when first passed, was had some limits on it in terms of income, and students had to have had some experience in a public school. There were some ways around it, but they were fairly limited. Over time, they have just kind of taken away the limits on how to access that program, so that now more than half of the students who receive vouchers have never had any experience in a public school. It was originally billed as an effort to allow children to escape from failing public schools, and that in itself is a very subjective. They set the parameters for what constitutes a failing school, and then they ran with it. Initially, it was going to be for kids who didn't have the money for private school tuition to transfer. It doesn't operate that way. Now, what the state of Indiana generally is doing is, if you always intended to send your child to a private parochial school, you can use your tax dollars to do it. And they did this by convincing Hoosiers of this concept of money follows the child, as if every child in Indiana is born with this backpack full of cash attached to them, and parents are the best people to decide, what quality school is, and they get to decide where their child goes to school. 1005 this year essentially blows off the income limits on this. So much higher percentages of wealthy families will be able to access vouchers. And again, there are a number of mechanisms in place with the scholarship, something called a scholarship granting organization. If a student receives one of those scholarships through that, they can enter the voucher program and then qualify for vouchers for the rest of the time they're in K through 12 school. So lots of ways to get into the program. Now moving the income limit up, families who haven't been able to access that because they simply made too much money will now be able to qualify for the program. So that's the big concern, but there are other provisions in it. These education savings accounts, which Indiana has not gotten into, I think, as much because we've had so many other programs, but other states have had these education savings accounts that essentially are like a debit card, and families will be able to say, we want to use this money on our debit card to essentially do whatever we want to do. In other states, these ESAs have proven to be terribly riddled with, anytime you have this large amount of public money, you're going to have these groups coming in and looking for ways to exploit people who aren't exactly sure what is a quality tutoring service, for example. And I'm not sure the safeguards are really in place. There are assurances from Bob Baining, the author of that bill, that there are safeguards on that money, but I'm not sure that we really can believe that, especially given the corruption and troubles we've seen with the state's virtual charter school program. The limits just don't seem to be there, and this just appears to be another way to hand out education dollars. And public schools understand that there is just one pot of money for public education. A lot of people believe that somehow there's a separate supply of money for vouchers and charter schools. There is not. There is one pie of K through 12 funding, and the more that is made available to charter schools and to voucher schools, the less is available for the 94% of students, families who attend traditional public schools.
Yeah, when this the hard thing about this topic is that this has been so long in the coming. This has been such a path, I like to say the garden path down to private for-profit religious education, which is where we are really headed. And of course, non-union staff, that's the goal, in my opinion. And I remember when Indiana passed the first law that said they were going to be able to send money to religious schools, and that, oh no, here's the red line. No, we do have this constitution that says there is a separation between church and state, and public money won't be going to religion. Well, and then I fell off my chair when I saw our Supreme Court said, no, that's okay. And the scheme at that time was that it was okay because the money wasn't going to the church. The money was going to the family, the student. And so in that way, if they spent it on church, well, that wasn't the same, even though it still was public tax dollars. So all of these things that have just been chipping away at a public school. And in my mind, I feel like it's like a mystery. I'm peeling back the layers like an onion, realizing how this has been happening over the last many years. And so it's hard to even talk about like a current bill without really acknowledging that this has been a long time plan to, make public education private, non-union, and religious. So it's really hard to, keep that in mind. When you see these little things like, well, this, every family will have their own little savings account, and they'll do a good job. So and they'll spend it on only high quality educational materials and services. I don't know. I just, and it'll go to people who really don't need that help. They have been always on their own buying those things. We know that's one of the biggest disparities in outcomes is children who have families who are able to take them to museums, take them to, concerts, take them to the symphony, take them to the library, and parents who don't have that kind of access. So this money isn't really going to change that disparity, which is unfortunate. So, okay. So thank you though, for all of your great knowledge on this. And I want to now move to our next bill that we want to talk about, which is the permitless, no questions asked. Everybody should have a gun. Nobody should know who's entitled to a gun when you walk up to them on the street, because you don't need a permit. I can't remember the number. That's my long name for it. So tell us about this bill, where it's been, where it's going, and what is going to happen.
That's a good question in terms of what's going to happen. I'm my suspicion is it could pass this session. The supporters call it constitutional carry. It's in place in other states. There are some interesting opponents coming out. Just this past week, we had an editorial in which we quoted our Republican Allen County Sheriff, Dave Gladio, as well as the Fort Wayne Police Chief. Early in the session, we had an editorial from quoting our Republican prosecutor, Karen Richards, who's very much opposed to the bill. Our sheriff puts it pretty simply. He said, this is a tool law enforcement has, essentially it's a protection that they now seem intent on taking away. When, example, in a traffic stop, they will call in a license plate number, and the dispatcher can tell them before they leave the safety of their car, by the way, that's a permit holder. And what the sheriff explained to me was, that's just kind of we always are on the alert, but when we find out that, yes, this person is licensed to carry, we know there's a good chance that whoever's behind the wheel has a gun, and it's just kind of an extra alert. He said, we sit up a little taller when we know that. Likewise, if they get a call about a domestic violence situation at an address, and they know, by the way, there's a permit holder who lives at this address, again, they know they're going into a situation where there will be guns. This would take that away. And a lot of law enforcement people are concerned about that. So if legislators are listening, I think, to their local law enforcement officials, and this Indiana State Troopers Association, Indiana State Police have come out against this, Fraternal Order of Police. I've heard that the Indiana Sheriff's Association might be taking a stand on it. The state police chiefs group is opposed to it. Our legislators are people who like to portray themselves as very much law and order and supporting law enforcement. So that could be what keeps this from passing. On the other hand, it's a bill, I believe it's been introduced a number of times. And, there are certainly a good number of our legislators who believe there should be no restrictions whatsoever on Second Amendment rights. Interestingly, these people have no concerns about voter ID requirements. Indiana was one of the first, I think we were the second in the nation to adopt a voter ID requirement. In other words, you've got to have a license, you've got to have some kind of an ID to go and vote, that our 15th Amendment rights are guaranteed, but they don't have any problem. They don't have any problem with that, but they do have a problem with any kind of a restriction on the Second Amendment rights, even though no less than Judge Scalia acknowledged in the Heller case that reasonable regulations on guns are acceptable. So we'll see. I don't know. I think this could be the session that it would happen. There was also the issue of how much money, there's money raised from, it's not a revenue neutral bill. The money from these permits went to local law enforcement for training purposes. So they've had to set aside some money in the proposed budget to make up for money that will be lost from this. So there's some obstacles to overcome, but I think they might be intent on doing it anyway.
Right. There's this notion that we're giving people more freedom, but it does actually cost the state money to do it. Just like in the education bill, the state will have to spend money to regulate people who are getting this ESA money and to regulate how they're spending it. Somebody will have to check on that. So that's going to cost money too. And of course, as to the constitutional rights, I like to compare it to my constitutional right to have an abortion. No one has a problem putting, extremely rigorous restrictions on that constitutional right. And I often ask my Second Amendment people, are you going to stand with me on my constitutional right to have an abortion with no restriction? And so they need to really kind of get their story straight. And, likewise, the people who say I'm a constitutionalist and in the same breath say, well, but we're a religious government. So yeah, it would be nice if they kind of get their story straight on all that. It really irritates me. So, and I guess my worry about the gun bill was, how does anyone know? So a police officer runs into someone and they see that they have a gun and they say, do you have a permit for that? Well, now they don't ask that, right? Because there's no permit. And so one never knows if they passed a background check or anything. And there's no way to know that. So, it just opens up so many possibilities for just crazy gun violence, which of course is already kind of off the chain. So, okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the wetlands bill. So we are in a special panic because this looks like it might really pass. And I've done a lot of environmental work over the years and really understand the value and the importance of wetlands to water quality. Do we want to have drinkable water in our aquifers? Well, if we do, we're going to have to make sure that runoff water and precipitation is properly filtered before it goes back into aquifers. So and wetlands are one of the greatest ways to do that. So now that we will move again to your freedom as an Indiana builder to cover every square inch of the land with cement. Oh my gosh. So tell me more about your opinion of that bill, what you think about it, and what you think will happen with that.
Senate Bill 389. I think it's probably one that they thought would go through quietly, but the environmental community, which is very, very much probably more bipartisan involvement in the environmental community than a lot of Indiana issues. So I think there's been some interesting response to this that the sponsors of the bill might not have imagined. So we have seen tremendous response in Northeast Indiana, and we're a part of the state. Somehow we have a lot of issues with flooding in the Fort Wayne area, and a lot of concerns about water quality and what we're sending by way of the Maumee River up to Lake Erie. So it definitely has gotten some attention in our part of the state. But we've seen, I can't even really think of a bill that I have never seen anybody step up and say, this is why we need this bill. We've heard that the Indiana Builders Association is a group that primarily is seeking this bill. I haven't seen anyone from the Builders Association step up to claim responsibility and to say, here's why we need this. Nobody really seems to be eager to defend this bill, which is maybe a little all the more surprising how many legislators have signed on as co-sponsors, co-authors of the bill. It eagerly was picked up on the House side. So I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what they personally are hearing, legislators, or how they're weighing the response to it, but there has been strong bipartisan opposition to it. We ran a fascinating op-ed from Senator Beverly Gard, a former state senator who truly is one of the environmental leaders in the state. She's originally from, represented the Greenfield area. And she was one of the authors, the primary author of the existing Indiana wetlands law. And she writes in this piece about how much work went into that and how carefully that legislation was formed. And she's very concerned about what's at play here. And she pins it entirely on the Builders Association. So whether or not lawmakers will look to counsel from someone like that, I don't know. It's leadership in both the House and the Senate caucuses on the Republican side. It's pretty strongly disciplined. So, they could keep people in line and move that bill ahead. I really don't know, but I will say I've never seen a bill that had such strong opposition, kind of from both sides of the aisle, and no one really publicly pushing it ahead. So again, we don't know what's going on behind the scenes on that. And, this has been a strange session. It's the COVID restrictions and what we know about what's going on. It's been tough to gauge, I think. I mean, pretty much what I've been able to observe of the legislature is, through online watching committee hearings and listening to discussion that way. The lobbyists that representatives for some of these environmental groups, for example, I don't think they're getting the same access and feedback to what discussions are happening that they might normally have. So it's a little bit of a question mark of what's going to happen.
Well, so it sounds like, something is happening behind the scenes, and somebody's putting some kind of secret pressure on Republicans. And of course, when this bill first came up, there was discussion about the conflict of interest of the authors, who I can't even remember right now. And so, of course, that makes me wonder if those same legislators are able to push people based on their own, profit margin, which is just unfortunate. So we've seen that a lot, certainly in the Attorney General's office and among other legislators. So, all right, so we're almost out of time, but I want to thank you so much. And I would love to just ask you, so any parting words of wisdom that you'd like to share before we go?
Well, I certainly wish Hoosiers would spend a little more time keeping an eye on the State House. I think there's a tendency to focus on Washington and what's happening there. And it really happens in Indianapolis. We didn't talk about redistricting issues. This would have been the session that we needed to get something done on redistricting in terms of setting up an independent commission. The people who are working to make that happen are not giving up on it. They have a wonderful project. I know you've talked with Julia Vaughn about this. They have this kind of shadow redistricting commission effort underway, and I think it's going to be fascinating. They're working with Tufts University on that, and I'm really anxious to see how that comes out. But I wish there was a way that Hoosiers would begin to put the pieces together of why we have these bills that we just talked about, permitless carry and the voucher bill and the wetlands bill, how legislation that is so troublesome can get this far. And it's because of this imbalance that we have at our State House. And until we start paying attention to what's happening there and start demanding changes that give voters more authority, I think we're going to continue to see this sort of outlandish legislation and not the kind of compromise and give and take that we need to be seeing. So I guess that would be my hope, is that people start paying more attention to what's happening in Indianapolis and at the State House.
Well, that's great. And what that says to me is we need to do this again. So I hope you'll join me again, and we can talk more about what happened during this legislature. And, you know, as you mentioned, we didn't talk about a lot of stuff. We also didn't talk about all of the great bills that just didn't even get a hearing. As we know in the House, or was it the Senate? I think it was, the Environmental Committee didn't even meet.
Right.
So we didn't even get to talk about that. So everything is so out of whack. It's hard to even get to all of the important things. So I hope you'll join me again, and you know, and we'll talk more about this. So it was really great to talk with you. You know so much. It's really great to get people like you out there who really have just terrific knowledge about what's happening in Indiana. And of course, I promise I will pay for the subscription for the Journal-Gazette and quit trying to cheat and, you know, get past the paywall. Because it is
we have great coverage, not just on the opinion side, but we have a full-time State House reporter. Nikki Kelly does a tremendous job. She's actually the dean of the State House reporters. She's been there over 20 years and does terrific work. So I want to put in a little plug for Nikki as well.
Good. All right, great. All right, well then, until next time, thanks, and we will sign off.
Thanks, I appreciate it.